the negotiations between the United States and Iran, as well as the impact the latest US Middle East entanglement has on world affairs, including Europe's and Ukraine's security. Our guest is John Bolton, who was President Trump's national security advisor in his first term. Ambassador Bolton, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be with you.
How would you describe the state of play in Iran? Is Donald Trump any closer to achieving US aims, shattering in Iran's nuclear program?
Well, Trump has trouble articulating exactly what his objectives are, which means measuring how close he is difficult as well. I think what he wants at the moment is to find a way out of the conflict, to be able to achieve a deal, declare a victory, and from his perspective, get the Strait of Hormuz open, get oil and gas flowing into international markets, and therefore in the U.S. to get the price at the pump of gasoline down, help reduce inflation, and help out, therefore, in the November midterm congressional elections. But he knows, on the other hand, if he makes a bad deal, he'll be very severely criticized. You know, the taco problem, Trump always chickens out. And he's in a place now where he doesn't have a good answer, and he's straining to find one.
But perhaps, you know, there is some consistency in what he and other members of the administration are saying, namely that they are not in a rush, that they are prepared to take a short-term pain. Trump made repeated comments saying, you know, I don't care about inflation in the short run. All I care about are Iran's nuclear weapons. Isn't that a sort of a reflection of real strategy?
Well, if he had a strategy, we would have known whether regime change was the objective or whether it was some other objective, because as long as the capability exists intellectually in the scientists and technicians in Iran, they can rebuild the program if the regime stays in power. And even though substantial damage was done both last year and in the past few months to the nuclear program, other aspects have not been touched at all, like the nuclear reactor at Bushehr, which has in the spent fuel in its cooling ponds enough plutonium produced by the nuclear reactions, which if it were reprocessed, proliferation experts in the U.S. estimate there's enough plutonium in that spent fuel to make between 200 and 400 nuclear weapons, and that hasn't been addressed at all.
So we heard today that Iran is backing off the negotiations. We don't know how serious that is, but that's what we heard. And Iran is quoting the fact that Israel has launched a new offensive in Lebanon. And as far as I understand, Iran has consistently linked the resolution of its standoff with the United States to what happens in Lebanon. Or is that just a smokescreen, in your opinion?
No, I think it's very real. I think the Iranians are trying to buy time. They believe time is on their side. They're in a test of wills with Trump, a test of resolve, who can last longer. Since they don't care about the economic situation of the Iranian people, they think they have the upper hand. And just earlier today, they have made this point of linking the war in Lebanon with the war against Iran itself. And Trump has apparently called both Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, and he says he's spoken with a Hezbollah leader, which would be something incredible for an American president, and that they have agreed to a ceasefire there. Now, this is, in typical fashion, very vague, with a lot of questions still remaining. But I think it goes to show what I think is Trump's basic motivation here. He wants to find a deal. He wants to declare victory, and he wants gasoline prices at U.S. service stations to come down.
But at the end of the day, he also wants to avoid a full-scale war, and he promised his voters not to get entangled in forever wars. So he's in a sense trying to limit the military intervention.
Well, if his intention had been to limit it from the beginning, I think he could have made that clear. One of his problems was, and remains, that he didn't really make the case to the American people before the hostilities began of why his objectives, whatever those objectives were important enough that we'd have to contemplate the use of military force. He didn't make that case to Congress. He didn't consult with our allies. Not only didn't he consult with NATO, he didn't consult with the Gulf Arab states. He didn't consult with our Pacific allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, that get so much of their oil and gas from the Middle East. And he didn't consult with the opposition inside Iran to see what role they could play if there was a chance at regime change. So these are complications that I think now may be coming home to roost, unfortunately.
Right. From Europe's and Ukraine's perspective, obviously, renewed hostilities, new American attacks would be partly bad news because it would mean less equipment, less deliveries for Europe and for Ukraine. So in a sense, the Europeans are probably a bit relieved that this is not going further, even if it's stalemate behind the negotiating table. What do you make of the Europeans' attitude to all of this?
Well, I think there's a legitimate concern. There certainly is concern in the United States that for decades now we have underestimated our military requirements. And even though we've been spending at 3% of GDP year after year, we remember now that back in the Cold War, we spent between 5 and 6%, for example, during the Reagan administration. And I think we are going to have to spend more simply because the rate of expenditure of artillery ammunition, missiles in Ukraine and in the war in Iran has been far greater than what people expected, and our stockpiles are not where they should be. But I do think Europe should understand that this war with Iran is their war too. The Iranians have carried out significant numbers of terrorist activities in Europe, as they have in North America, and Europe is closer to Iran than the United States and could be reached by Iran's intermediate range ballistic missiles. So this is something that I think affects all of us, and it shows to me why the importance of the NATO alliance is growing, not lessening.
Even though America is reducing its troop commitments and other weapons to NATO, but in a sense, we should expect that because this is what all American administrations have been saying for the last 10 or 15 years, that the Europeans need to look after themselves when it comes to security.
Well, I think a functioning alliance requires everybody to have participation equivalent to their capabilities. The fundamental question for the United States is where our security is enhanced by alliances and where it may not be. And I think we've got a split within Europe. I think that's the problem. I think if you ask Eastern and Central European countries, they understand what the problem is. It's some of the countries in Western Europe, Spain, for example, and others, that simply don't seem to be willing to meet their obligations.
But even Central Europeans were rather reluctant to offer any significant help to President Trump, possibly because they weren't consulted, as you mentioned earlier, and it wasn't really done in cooperation with the allies.
Well, I think, as I said, I think the lack of consultation was a mistake, but I think European leaders have to avoid the sort of personal affront that they weren't consulted and to think strategically. You know, price for petroleum is set globally. We in the U.S. import almost no oil from the Gulf. Europe imports very little. But when the price goes up, bidders around the world are going to match that price. So giving Iran control over the Strait of Hormuz is really a very dangerous precedent, bad for the Gulf Arabs for sure, but also over who controls other waterways that are international waterways, but not the open ocean, the Dardanelles and the Bosporus in Turkey, for example, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, the Kattegat and the Skagerrak between Denmark, Sweden, and Norway to get out of the Baltic. These are all very constrained waterways that the Iranian precedent really is very dangerous for.
Ambassador Bolton, former U.S. National Security Advisor, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me.
And that's all we've got for you in this newscast, but please stay with us for more news and analysis.